The editor of the Territorial Enterprise had never seen or heard anyone quite like him before. Slouched in a wooden chair in front of him was a bedraggled stranger, exhausted and covered in dust, wearing a floppy old hat, a revolver in his belt, and a bedroll on his back. The year was 1861. Abraham Lincoln was president, and the Civil War had begun. But out here in the Western Territories, life was pretty removed from it all. In many ways, it was still the Wild West. The editor had seen all kinds of characters and vagabonds pass through Virginia City, but there was something unusual about this guy. A certain wry expression, a certain twinkle in the eyes, and a certain determination. He had walked 130 miles to the Nevada Territory, and now he looked straight up from his chair and announced, "My starboard leg seems to be unshipped. I'd like about 100 yards of line. I think I'm falling to pieces. My name is Clemens, and I've come to write for the paper." With that colorful introduction, Samuel Clemens staked his claim on his chosen career. It was a claim that would hit pay dirt. Within only a few years, he would be one of the most popular and famous writers in America. But first, he would choose a new name, one that reflected his boyhood passion with rivers and steamboats: Mark Twain. Mark Twain was perhaps the most important literary influence on the writers that followed him in the 20th century. Many writers, including Ernest Hemingway and William Faulkner, have stated that it was Twain who had the greatest effect on their own work. During his own times, Twain achieved worldwide fame and considerable fortune as an author, and also as a lecturer, traveler, satirist, and humorist. His success isn't surprising. Besides the appeal of his books, he possessed drive, determination, energy, and a willingness to experiment with and perfect his talents. From the beginning, Mark Twain's writing was distinguished by a certain irreverence and mockery of foolish people and foolish institutions. He was an outspoken opponent of injustice and hypocrisy, and took great pleasure in stripping away facades and pretensions. That's one reason that during his lifetime his books were often scorned by critics and banned by librarians who considered them vulgar and unrefined. Intellectuals also claimed his books were insignificant and frivolous. But none of this ever affected the views of the populace, which affectionately dubbed him America's funny man. Today, his books command great respect from not just the public, but from critics and scholars. One of the specialties of Twain's work is his unique humor, a combination of irony, satire, wit, and whimsy that can delight and provoke at the same time. He's considered the master of what's called American humor, that particular brand of local, hearty humor that emerged from the American West. This humor had its foundation in the Western frontiersman who loved his country and loved life, but who also saw things with a clarity and insight that escaped the educated, pretentious Easterner. Twain was born Samuel Longhorn Clemens in Florida, Missouri on November 30th, 1835, as Halley's Comet whipped across the skies. Twain often spoke of that celestial event and called the comet and himself unaccountable freaks. He said that, having come in together, they were bound to go out together. That's exactly what happened. The same comet passed by again 75 years later, when Twain died. Clemens was brought up on the Mississippi River in the town of Hannibal, Missouri. He grew up in a country environment, surrounded by the river, islands, and woods. He swam, he played hooky, and he read books. Like the young heroes in his novels, Twain got into a lot of trouble as a child. He hid snakes in his aunt's sewing basket and bats in his mother's pockets. Once he dropped a watermelon onto his brother's head from 3 stories above him. He once said, "I was born excited." Twain started writing shortly after the death of his father in 1847, when he was 12 years old. He first apprenticed to a printer, but found it a hard living, so he joined his brother on the staff of the Hannibal Journal as a copywriter. At that time, he began reading the works of a group of writers referred to as the Southwestern humorists. Between the years of 1853 and 1857, when he was in his early 20s, Clemens traveled to New York, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and Cincinnati, sending articles to the Journal under various pseudonyms. On a visit to New Orleans, he learned to pilot steamboats, and he stayed with that occupation until the Civil War forced the close of the river. These experiences provided material for Life on the Mississippi. Twain joined up to fight in the Civil War on the side of the Union, but he lasted only 2 weeks. Later he joked, "I got tired of retreating." In 1861, Clemens traveled by stagecoach to Nevada with his brother, and after unsuccessful attempts at gold mining, he walked into the Virginia City Territorial Enterprise and announced he was there to write for them. In 1863, he adopted the now famous pseudonym Mark Twain. It was a boatman's call that meant the water was 2 fathoms deep, therefore safe enough for the steamboat. In his first published story, he appeared as Mark Swain. The editor had misread his handwriting. Twain arrived in San Francisco in 1864, where he earned the nickname Wild Humorist of the Pacific Slope. He fell in with a group of writers known as the local colorists, which included, among others, Bret Harte. When he published the story The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County in 1865, he achieved national fame. Following that, he traveled to Hawaii and sent articles back to the Sacramento Union. He returned and used material from his travels for his first lecture, a lecture that would mark the start of a long and successful career as a public speaker. Twain loved to talk, and he loved it even better when he could make people laugh. He said he enjoyed nothing more than being, in his words, killingly funny. Next, he traveled to the Mediterranean and the Holy Land, travels that resulted in the popular Innocents Abroad, which was published in 1869 and gained him international acclaim. In the book, he satirizes the folly of going across the Atlantic to see dead men's graves when there are many living things to see right here. In 1870, Twain was on board a ship to the Holy Land when he met a man from New York called Charles Langdon. Langdon showed Twain a picture of his sister, Olivia, and Twain was so taken with her that he resolved to meet her. Later, he finagled a 1-week visit to the Langdon family, and during that visit, he fell deeply in love. On the last day of his visit, he told Charles Langdon he didn't want to leave that night as planned, but he knew he really should leave because he'd fallen in love with Olivia. Charles was upset by this news. Olivia was the darling of the family, and her brother was feeling protective. He suggested that he take Twain to the train station immediately and put him on the very next train out of town. Twain resisted, so they agreed he could stay for dinner, and they'd head for the station directly afterwards. They set out as planned, but the seat of the wagon hadn't been properly locked in place, and both were pitched into the street. Neither man was seriously hurt, but Twain used the accident as an excuse to stay at the Langdon house and recover. He stretched that recovery to another 2 weeks, and by the time it was up, he and Olivia were engaged. On their first official date, Twain took Olivia to see a reading by Charles Dickens. For the rest of their long marriage, Olivia served as Twain's editor, scratching out anything in his stories that she didn't like. After he married, Twain served briefly as an editor for the Buffalo Express. Then, in 1871, he moved to Connecticut and gave up journalism to devote himself to serious literature. There, he wrote Roughing It, an account of his years in the West, The Gilded Age, a satire on the way the federal government was run, and Tom Sawyer, written in 1875 and released the following year. He was 40 years old. During this time, Twain had been reading the dime novels that were just becoming popular as boys' literature, and he was also being influenced by writers like Dickens, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Wilkie Collins, and Bret Harte. From 1878 to 1879, Twain's travels in Europe inspired A Tramp Abroad and The Prince and the Pauper, his first historic novel. He would return to that genre later with A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, a fictional indictment of political and social injustice. In 1884, when he was 49, he established his own firm and published the masterpiece Huckleberry Finn. Twain was a dedicated and hard-working writer who practiced at it like a craftsman. He would write several different versions of one scene, read his stories to family and friends, and reuse material in different ways with a different emphasis. He made a lot of money off his writings, and he also lost a lot of money. When he was doing well, he built an enormous house in Hartford, Connecticut that had 19 rooms plus 5 bathrooms. He slept in a huge black bed carved with angels. Twain made lots of bad investments, and because of increasing financial problems, he moved to Europe in 1891. He declared bankruptcy 3 years later after his publishing firm failed and a large investment in a typesetting machine didn't pay off. He'd also been asked to invest in Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, but that one he passed up. Nevertheless, when the phone was complete, he was the very first American to order one. He was also the first writer to work on a typewriter. He found it helpful when rheumatism afflicted his writing arm. During the bankruptcy years, he churned out a number of works, but they were generally inferior to his best. They included The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson, Tom Sawyer Abroad, Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc, and Tom Sawyer, Detective. To recoup his financial losses, Twain set out on a worldwide lecturing tour in 1895. Although he was now in his 60s, he was popular everywhere he went, and the audience enjoyed him as much as he enjoyed himself. Once, when Twain arrived in a small town for a lecture, he went to the barber first for a shave. The barber told him it was a good day to be visiting, because Mark Twain was lecturing that night. Would he like to go? Twain replied, "I guess so." The barber then asked him if he'd purchased a ticket yet. Twain said he hadn't. Finally, the barber announced, "Well, it's sold out, so you'll have to stand." "Just my luck," responded Twain. "I always have to stand when that fellow lectures." Twain traveled so much that his friends often had a hard time finding him. One year, they wanted to send him birthday greetings, but they knew he was on the road and they didn't know which town he was in. Half as a joke, they mailed him a card addressed to Mark Twain, God knows where. A few weeks later, they received a response from Twain that simply read, "He did." It was said that Mark Twain was the most photographed man in America in his day, but generally he liked the attention. Twain always wore white linen suits, no matter what the season. He chose white because he said it made him feel clean in a dirty world. He designed his own shirts, which buttoned up the back instead of the front. Twain didn't like to dress too fancy, though. Once, when his wife admonished him for visiting Harriet Beecher Stowe without a tie on, he put one in a box and sent it to Miss Stowe with the message, "Here's a necktie. Take it out and look at it. At the end of that time, you will kindly return it, as it is the only one I have." He was addicted to cigars and smoked as many as 40 a day. Once he described moderation in his personal habits as never smoking more than one cigar at a time. It was Twain who made the famous comment, "Quitting is easy. I've done it 100 times." His other favorite pastimes included playing pool, watching baseball games, and taking long walks in the country. He loved cats and had a whole collection of them, many with such fearful names as Pestilence, Famine, Sin, and Satan. His little daughter Susie once remarked, "The difference between Papa and Mama is that Mama loves morals and Papa loves cats." Although his financial situation improved, his later life was plagued by sorrow. His wife and his daughter Susie both died within a period of 4 years. After Susie died, he found the Christmas present she intended to give him, a large world globe, just as he'd always wanted. Twain was overcome with grief and ceased to write. Shortly after, his daughter Clara moved with her husband to Europe, leaving him only with his daughter Jean. Jean was an epileptic who suffered a heart attack during a seizure and died. 4 months after Jean died, Mark Twain suffered a heart attack himself and died on April 21, 1910. At that time, he was reading Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Disillusioned by his losses, the older Twain was a bitter writer. His works of the late 1890s and early 1900s became more cynical than ever and included scathing reviews of human nature. Some of his last writings were withheld from the public by his estate because of the savage nature of their satire. Fortunately, he'd already left the world with many other brilliant classics that are still, 100 years later, among the most popular novels to ever come out of America. Twain's earliest great work was Tom Sawyer, written far before tragedy and disappointment had taken their toll on the writer. He drew on his memories of Florida and Hannibal, Missouri for the setting of the novel, and tells us at the end that the people who inspired the characters were still alive at the time the story was written. Twain said most of the book was based on true stories. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer was written in 1876, the centennial of the American Revolution, the year Colorado entered the Union. Rutherford Hayes, the son of a farmer and a major general in the Civil War, was elected president, and Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Twain wrote it quickly, finishing as many as 50 pages a day. The book is best known for the way in which it captures the spirit of boyhood, particularly as it was experienced in a small Mississippi town in the mid-19th century. The setting is St. Petersburg, Missouri, about 30 years before the Civil War, during the 1830s. The hero, Tom, is an imaginative, rebellious boy who is thrown into a series of adventures that involve hidden treasures, caves, graveyards, and murder. It's all the stuff that excites a young boy's fancy, but which, when it becomes reality, can be just a little too frightening. Tom has a sweetheart, Becky Thatcher, and the ups and downs of their romance are a major subplot in the book. He also has a friend, Huckleberry Finn, a wild, independent character who shuns school and lives by himself in the woods. The book inspired 3 sequels, including Huckleberry Finn, which is considered Twain's greatest work. In the preface to Tom Sawyer, Twain indicates the book is an adventure tale for youngsters, and it's true that it's still best known as a children's classic. But the book also has much to offer adults, particularly in the humorous jabs at respected institutions and the lambasting of the pompous and pretentious people who uphold those institutions. Ultimately, however, the charm of Tom Sawyer is that it's a colorful record of the life of a boy in a small town, a boy who craves excitement, and when it's missing, creates it for himself with the help of all the books he's read about knights, kings, robbers, and pirates. Mark Twain had a particular disdain for those types of books, the romantic novel invented and made popular by Sir Walter Scott, and in some ways Tom's experiences are an indictment of the influence of such romantic stories. His need for showmanship and for gaudy and dramatic events is sometimes selfish and creates pain and troubles for other people, even those he loves. Still, Tom Sawyer isn't a moralistic book. It's simply a realistic book. Tom is what's been called a genuine boy, basically good-hearted, but by no means a model of decorum. He gets in fights, he likes to show off, he lies now and then, he plays hooky, but he's also brave when he has to be, and he stands by his friends. His adventures may seem extraordinary, but the book was made to appeal to boys, and Mark Twain knew them well. Mark Twain's style in this book, as in others, has the qualities of the small-town storyteller. Twain always keeps his diction and style consistent with a boy's point of view. He never falls back on adult language unless there's a reason to do it. The result is that we feel completely immersed in the world of the children, an effect Charles Dickens was also able to achieve in his books. In fact, the two authors are often compared. Mark Twain wrote about a boy's coming of age in America, and Dickens wrote about the coming of age of boys in England. This coming of age is something of which Mark Twain paints a vivid picture. He evokes all the bright and carefree days of youth, the wild imagination, the sensitivity and wonder, the crushing disappointments, and the passionate yearnings. This understanding, reflected in the charm of his characters and his colorful descriptions, is what makes Tom Sawyer a paean to boyhood. Tom and Huck and their friends possess the attributes and vices of little boys everywhere: the mischievousness, the flair for adventure, the fascination with superstition, the love of attention, the sensitive imagination, and the tender heart. But they're also genuine products of the American frontier heritage, drawn to exploring, cherishing their freedom and independence, and attracted and bound to nature. Mark Twain also manages to take some well-aimed shots at society in Tom Sawyer. His satirical bite is felt throughout the book, in many little phrases, incidents, and descriptions that mocked the manners and practices of the small town and its residents, and which particularly mocked the town's officials. In 1882, 6 years after he'd published The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Twain wrote another story about two young boys who share exciting adventures in life, although their relationship is quite different from that of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. These boys share their adventures apart from each other, in different places, with different people. But although they only encounter each other twice, at the beginning and end of the story, there is nevertheless a strong and intimate bond between them. The boys are named Edward and Tom, but they are famous in the world of literature as The Prince and the Pauper. The Prince and the Pauper is primarily a children's book. In fact, in his preface, Twain dedicates the book to his young daughters, Clara and Susie. But like most of the Twain novels written for children, it's also a social and political satire, replete with Twain's sense of irony and his mockery of facade and pretension. Twain had already started and was still working on Huckleberry Finn when he began The Prince and the Pauper. Huck Finn was a difficult novel that would take him years to complete and would eventually be considered his masterpiece. Because of this parallel writing, readers can find many comparisons between the two stories. Twain was a writer who liked to experiment with his ideas. He would repeat the same idea in different books, with different settings and emphasis. There are therefore many scenes in The Prince and the Pauper which not only evoke Huckleberry Finn, but which also evoke Tom Sawyer, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, or other writings by Twain. Nevertheless, The Prince and the Pauper is considered more of a children's book than Huckleberry Finn and other Twain novels, because the story is so straightforward and far less allegorical and metaphorical. The Prince and the Pauper is basically a story about a case of mistaken identity in which two boys, with very different backgrounds and temperaments, suddenly find themselves living each other's lives. It's set in England in 1547, during the reign of the infamous Henry VIII, an indulgent and unjust king who's best known for the way in which he heartlessly dispensed with a series of unfortunate wives. The heir to Henry's throne is his son Edward, the Prince of Wales. Edward is of course raised in luxury, and early on develops a sense of his unique importance and power. Across town in the slums of England lives another little boy named Tom Canty. He bears a strong physical resemblance to Edward, but there the similarities end. Tom lives a completely opposite lifestyle. He's a beggar who is regularly beaten by his father and grandmother if he doesn't return home with enough alms. One day the two boys exchange stories with each other, and then they get the inspiration to change clothes with each other. That's where the trouble starts. Although Edward simply wants to see if he can feel what it's like to be Tom, by donning the latter's rags, he gets a great deal more than he bargained for. For through a series of mishaps, the boys have soon exchanged not only clothes, but position in life. Tom is soon masquerading as the future King of England, while Edward is enduring the rigors of life as a pauper. Their reactions to their new circumstances and the inner transformation that takes place when they're exposed to the other side of life is the basis of the story. The story is fiction, although it contains a few historical characters, but Twain takes pleasure in telling us that, in his words, it may have happened, it may not have happened, but it could have happened. The reader certainly wants to believe it could happen, for it's a tantalizing idea to believe a beggar boy could suddenly rise in life while a proud and spoiled prince could be forced to face reality. By the end of the story, the haughty Edward has developed a sympathy for his country's downtrodden and a commitment to social justice. Probably the only reason Twain used the real Prince Edward as a figure in the story is that Edward's short reign as a boy king was noted for its mercy and compassion during an era when monarchs were usually known for quite the opposite. Twain's abhorrence of pretense and injustice is everywhere in The Prince and the Pauper. This unique literary skill of hiding humor in tragedy, of hiding social commentary in boyish adventure, is what distinguishes Mark Twain's work. It's why no one seems able to decide if Twain's novels are children's books or adult literature. The obvious answer is that they are both. The novel that critics and scholars almost unanimously agree was Mark Twain's finest work is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Ernest Hemingway once said, "All modern American literature comes from Huckleberry Finn." Twain sat down to write this sequel to Tom Sawyer in 1876, but it wasn't released until almost 10 years later, first in England and then in America. He found it a difficult story to write and repeatedly put it aside to write other books, including The Prince and the Pauper, A Tramp Abroad, and Life on the Mississippi, all of which show some similarity to Huckleberry Finn. In writing Huck Finn, the author was beset by plot problems and often had to bide his time until further inspiration struck. He has said that he went along fine until Chapter 16 and was then befuddled as to where to go next. Chapter 16 is a turning point in the story. The chapters before that all deal with the escape from slavery of Huck's friend Jim. The two have been fleeing down the Mississippi River, and in Chapter 16 they discover they've passed their point of destination and are now headed for the pro-slavery country of the Deep South. Apparently, Twain felt he'd created a problem that even he couldn't solve, but solve it he did. It's probably no coincidence that the story that gave Mark Twain the most trouble is the story that's considered his masterpiece. The most important modern studies of Twain have all focused on Huckleberry Finn, and many modern writers consider it to be the most influential book of the 19th century. This was not exactly the same reception it had upon its release in 1885. Although it was immediately a popular success, critics and censors took issue with the book. It was banned in many places, including, for example, the Concord, Massachusetts Public Library, which labeled it coarse, inelegant, and the veriest trash. What they were really reacting to was realism, for Huckleberry Finn is regarded as one of the first novels, if not the first, in a genre referred to as realistic American fiction. The realism in Huck Finn is achieved partly by Mark Twain's mastery of local dialect. All the characters use the colloquial speech appropriate to their background, and this speech is so precise and distinctive that Twain often doesn't even tell us who's speaking. We recognize the characters immediately by their individual dialect. Twain said that among the dialects he used for the book were the Missouri Negro dialect, the extremist form of the backwoods southwestern dialect, the ordinary Pike County dialect, and 4 modified varieties of this last. Even today, the book Huckleberry Finn has occasionally been banned in schools and libraries because it's considered to portray racial stereotypes, particularly in Twain's treatment of Jim, the escaped slave. Yet Jim was the wisest and most humane character in the book. In many ways, he was Huck's savior. Mark Twain would have been puzzled and upset by claims of racism in his writings. He abhorred slavery. He was appalled by the treatment of blacks in America, and he paid the expenses for the first black students at Yale and various other colleges. Huckleberry Finn is a vivid and unique picture of the South during the pre-Civil War era of the 1840s. And like most of Twain's books, there is humorous but biting satire on various social evils, including racism, sentimentalism, ignorant conformity, cruelty, and fraud. By the time the book was written, Twain had already earned the nickname America's Funny Man, and it was a nickname he liked. The comic qualities of Huckleberry Finn don't often receive the most attention, but they are part of what makes the book so appealing, and part of what helps to soften the sharp satire and social commentary. Coursing through these themes and the dynamic plot itself is the mighty, all-powerful Mississippi River, a deity of sorts that is unpredictable, life-giving, and a source of inner peace and freedom. On the river, all is well. But whenever the characters venture onto shore, they are in civilization, and civilization to the cynical Mark Twain means man at his worst. On his journey down the river, Huckleberry Finn will grow and expand, triumph over his weaknesses, and exercise his virtues in a way that characterizes a true literary hero. Huck's adventure on the Mississippi River with his friend Jim is one of the most exciting and profound voyages in the history of literature. Some consider it almost mythical. Mark Twain's last great novel was one he wrote as an allegory, a fictional story that teaches or illustrates certain moral principles and abstract truths. The book is entitled A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, and it's one of Twain's strongest and most satirical indictments of political and social injustice. Mark Twain wrote A Connecticut Yankee in the year 1889 when he was 54, about 5 years after he'd released his masterpiece, Huckleberry Finn. During the years that followed, Twain produced books that failed to achieve the popularity and critical acclaim of his previous works, and he suffered personal losses that seemed to affect his art. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is set in 6th century England during the reign of King Arthur, in the mythical days of Camelot and the Knights of the Round Table. But Mark Twain offers us a very untraditional view of those days, and of the king and knights who have been so romanticized and glorified by legend. The book was inspired by another book, Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur, which means The Death of Arthur. Twain was fascinated by the book and recorded that one night he actually dreamed of being a knight in Arthur's court and of the many inconveniences of life in the 6th century. That dream inspired him to write his story of an inventive, resourceful Yankee who's suddenly transported to Camelot and sets out to improve the conditions of its unenlightened citizenry. Like many of his books, including Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, the story is an assault on romantic views of gloomy periods of history, and indirectly on the books that promote that view. He takes the opposite approach of Sir Walter Scott, a man whose writing he enjoyed mocking, and exposes knight-errantry in feudal times as something of a barbaric nightmare, not at all uplifting and noble as it's often portrayed, but characterized instead by cruelty, ignorance, and the abuse of the lower classes. A Connecticut Yankee is yet another example of Mark Twain's ability to blend humor and whimsy with sharp attacks on man's inhumanity and prejudice. There are hilariously comedic scenes juxtaposed with scenes of slavery, torture, murder, and execution. He originally envisioned the book as a burlesque of Camelot, but as the story emerged, so too did his social outrage. It's the constant and effective balance between social humor and social criticism that makes the story so memorable. A Connecticut Yankee is filled with colorful characters, many of them borrowed from legend and others created by Twain himself. The hero, Hank, is an American, and his adventures are a testimonial to the Yankee attributes of practicality and ingenuity. Hank doesn't panic when confronted with the bizarre series of events he experiences. He remains level-headed and uses the resources at his command to solve his problems. He uses an eclipse to convince people he has superior powers. He blows smoke from his pipe to frighten advancing knights, and he brings electricity to his aid when he's outnumbered by an assaulting army. In short, he uses common sense to triumph over passion and ignorance. These ideals of justice, compassion, freedom, and just plain common sense were ideals Mark Twain strongly believed in, and they're ideals reflected in every one of his writings. Ironically, it's these ideals that were also responsible for his cynicism, since he despaired at mankind ever being able to achieve them. Mark Twain was an author who was disappointed in his fellow man. In his own biography, he even wonders why the human race was created and deems it a pity that Noah didn't miss the ark. Twain's chief complaint was that man tended to be cruel and hypocritical, and that he was basically a conformist and a follower, content to tag along with those who made the most show of things. But Twain was not a hopeless cynic. He also believed in certain virtues, among them man's superior intellect and imagination, and his energy, ambition, and productivity. Whether or not humanity could live up to its potential, Twain was not sure. But his stories will always provide us with stirring and vivid accounts of just why we might want to try.